Today, as the day closed outside, I wrote this story thinking about you. She is one of those stories of prosperity that doesn't start with wealth, but with silence, with small choices, and with the courage to reprogram the way of thinking even when everything seems to go wrong. Before we start, can I ask you something? If these stories have kept you company, subscribe to the channel, because here, every night is an invitation to mental reprogramming of wealth with words that calm and ideas that awaken. And if sleep hasn't arrived yet, tell me here in the comments, what was the lightest thought you had today? Sometimes a simple idea is already a seed of change right there. I read everything with affection, and I answered too. Now take a deep breath. Today's story begins where almost no one pays attention, in the silent doubt of someone who thought about stopping, but decided to take just one more step, because prosperity, sometimes, it starts when we change the tone of our own inner voice. He woke up every day before the sun, not because he had to, not because of any alarm or duty, but because something inside him insisted that the world began better when someone whispered something kind before anything else. His name was Eli, and he lived alone in an old crooked house at the edge of a forgotten village. The bed creaked, the floor was cold, and the roof made sounds like old ghosts rearranging their regrets, but none of that disturbed him. As soon as he opened his eyes, he took a deep breath, let the silence breathe with him, and then spoke the words that had become his sacred ritual. May all that is meant for me arrive with gentleness. May all that is not leave in peace. That was it. 2 sentences, the same ones, every day. Even when the electricity bill hovered like a threat, even when the fridge stood quiet and empty, even when his joints ached and his spirit felt small, the blessing was the first gift he gave to the day, even when nothing returned it. He didn't remember exactly when it started. Maybe after he lost his job? Maybe after the last letter came back unanswered? Maybe after the 3rd attempt to start again fell into a silence so vast it echoed in his bones? But instead of cursing the void, he chose to bless it. He chose to water the soil of absence with faith, even when no seeds could be seen. The village he lived in was small, and everyone else's life seemed louder than his. People rushed by, carrying bags, burdens, and urgency. Eli just watched with eyes that looked like they had already cried all the tears they'd ever needed. There was no bitterness in his gaze, only a quiet acceptance, the kind you find in rivers that keep flowing even when no one hears them. He spent his mornings sweeping his porch, even though no one visited. Sometimes he hung dried flowers on strings just to see the wind play with them. He made weak coffee, boiled water in a dented kettle, and ate bread he baked himself, even if no one ever said it was good. And after all that, he would repeat the blessing, looking toward the clouds. May all that is meant for me arrive with gentleness. May all that is not leave in peace. He spoke softly, but with his whole heart. The sky listened, even if it said nothing. One morning, he forgot to say it. He was sick, burning with fever, unable to rise. When he tried again the next day, the words came out trembling, as if the silence had grown used to their absence. He apologized to the wind, to the ceiling, to the quiet morning itself. And then he began again. Not with noise, not with proof, but with hope stitched to every syllable. People noticed it was strange. They didn't say it cruelly, but curiously. "That man who talks to himself," some would whisper. "He's always thanking the sky." But Eli didn't mind. He wasn't trying to convince anyone. His blessing wasn't a performance. It was a seed he planted in time, without needing to see when or how it would bloom. Sometimes, after speaking it aloud, he would sit by the window and imagine those words flying gently into the air like birds made of breath, landing on rooftops, slipping into cracks, curling around corners where someone might need them. He never asked for anything specific. No money, no success, just peace and presence and the arrival of what was truly his. Over time, something strange began to happen. Not loud things, not miracles, but little movements. He found an envelope. On his doorstep, no name, just a single pressed daisy inside. One evening, a neighbor left bread by his door, warm and wrapped in a scarf. A child, whom he'd never met, ran past him and said, "Your porch always smells like hope." He smiled, but he never claimed credit. He never thought the world owed him anything. He just kept blessing. And the world, quietly, started blessing him back. He had never seen a seed grow. Not really. He had planted a few in his lifetime. As a boy, as a man, as someone trying to feel useful. He'd dug holes in the earth, placed hopeful little kernels inside, covered them, and waited, but nothing ever sprouted. Still, he kept watering them. He watered what wasn't growing, as if tending to something invisible. Some would call it madness. Eli called it love. Every morning, after repeating his blessing, he would walk behind the house where the soil was dry and stubborn. He carried a little tin can, dented at the rim, and poured water onto the ground where nothing green had ever pushed through. He didn't expect miracles. He didn't even expect results. He just liked the feeling of giving something that didn't demand. The act was enough. One morning, he found a rock had shifted just slightly beside one of his silent patches of soil. Not a leaf, not a bud, not a stem, just a rock, but it was enough to make him pause. He bent down, placed his hand on the earth, and whispered, "Even if you never grow, I'll keep showing up." Because that's what the blessing had taught him. Some things aren't about proof. They're about posture, about what we choose to do when no one is looking, about how we hold ourselves while waiting, and waiting, and waiting. The world had taught him more than once that waiting could feel like punishment, that hope, when stretched too long, can tear at the seams. But Eli had found a way to make waiting feel sacred. He stitched small rituals into his hours. He lit a candle at sunset, even when there was no one to share the glow. He mended socks with holes, not because he needed them perfect, but because he respected their story. He sang softly while hanging laundry, even if only the wind clapped. On days when the clouds sat low and heavy, he would sit with them, not asking them to leave, just offering company. There was a rhythm to his silence, a heartbeat in his stillness. His neighbors began to notice things they hadn't before. A woman who had always rushed past him on her way to work began slowing down. Once, she even stopped and asked, "Do you always water that same patch of dirt?" Eli smiled and said, "Yes." She didn't ask why. She just nodded and walked on, as if something in her had been watered, too. A boy began leaving feathers on Eli's steps. A teenager started whistling his blessing. Not the words, just the tune he hummed after saying it. A man who had once shouted at Eli for being too quiet now passed him and tipped his hat. The soil behind the house remained the same, dry, uneventful, but Eli never stopped watering it. Not because he expected it to change, but because he had. One morning, after months, or maybe years of repetition, something tiny broke through the dirt. Not a flower, not even a full leaf, just a green thread, so thin it could have been missed. But Eli saw it. He knelt beside it, placed his hand near but not on it, and whispered, "You're not late. You're right on time." He didn't tell anyone. He didn't take a photo. He didn't post or share or name it. He just watched it for a while. Then he got up, went back inside, and repeated his blessing again. May all that is meant for me arrive with gentleness. May all that is not leave in peace. And something in the room, maybe the light, maybe the silence, smiled back. The third winter came quiet, not in wind, but in wait. Everything outside Eli's home seemed slowed, wrapped in a softness made of cold and stillness. Even the birds seemed to pause between chirps, as if listening. It was during one of those slow mornings that Eli felt something shift, not outside, but inside him. The blessing he had said for years now rolled off his tongue in a new way. Not different in sound, but in depth. It no longer felt like a request. It felt like a remembering. As if he was no longer asking the world to be kind, but reminding it that it already was. That morning, his voice cracked slightly when he said it. May all that is meant for me arrive with gentleness. May all that is not leave in peace. And when he opened the door, something waited on the step. Not a gift, not a sign, just a paper, folded, weather-stained. A single sentence written in pencil, not signed, not titled. I heard you. That was it. Just that. Eli held the note with both hands. He didn't need to know who had written it. He didn't even need to know what they meant, because it meant everything. It was the first time the echo came back. Not as thunder, not as applause, but as a whisper that felt like a hand on the shoulder of his soul. He placed the note inside the drawer where he kept candle wicks and loose tea, not to hide it, but to let it live near the things that held warmth. From that day on, small messages began to appear, not every day, not loudly, not in predictable places. Sometimes scratched into benches, sometimes tucked between stones, sometimes on napkins folded into shapes. They never said much. Thank you. You reminded me. I believe again. But they carried weight. The kind of weight that doesn't press down, but lifts. He never replied, never searched, never announced. He simply kept blessing. The soil behind the house, now green with a single thin stem, began to host more sprouts. Not a garden, not abundance, just small, quiet affirmations that the earth had been listening all along. People in the village, once strangers, started knocking. They didn't always speak. Some stood on his porch for a moment, then walked away. Others left thinkstones with drawings, jars with feathers, coins with holes, books with pages missing. He didn't ask why. He just made space. The inside of his house slowly changed. Not cluttered, not curated, but arranged in a way that made memory feel alive. A chair beside a blanket someone dropped off. A cracked cup with a dried flower inside. A mirror that reflected only light, not faces. It all made sense without having to. He often sat by the window at night, holding his tea, and asked the sky no questions. He'd simply look and let it be. One night, a soft knock came. He opened the door and found a little girl holding a shoebox. "This is for you," she said, and ran. Inside the box were folded papers, dozens, all handwritten, all blessings. Some mirrored his, others were new. May your hands always remember softness. May your steps echo in the right direction. May you be trusted by the wind. Eli cried that night, not because he was sad, not because he was overwhelmed, but because for the first time, the void he had been blessing all these years had spoken back in a language only the heart understands. He placed one of the papers under his pillow and whispered the same words he always had. But this time, he felt them land like seeds that had finally chosen to sprout. And in the silence that followed, he smiled, 'cause he knew the world had never ignored him. It was just preparing to answer at the right time. There came a day when Eli woke up, later than usual. The sun had already begun its slow stretch across the curtains, and birds were mid-conversation. He blinked, not with panic, but with curiosity, as if wondering whether the world still waited for him. He sat up, rubbed his hands together like he always did, and whispered the blessing into the softened morning light. May all that is meant for me arrive with gentleness. May all that is not leave in peace. And something strange happened. The moment he said it, a wind passed gently through the window, lifting the edge of a paper on his table. It wasn't magical. It wasn't dramatic. But Eli smiled anyway, because by now he had learned to recognize even the smallest response. That day, as he walked through the village, people greeted him differently. A nod from a stranger, a flower left on a step, a baker who handed him a loaf and said, "This is extra." He didn't ask questions. He didn't assume it meant anything more than kindness ripening in secret. The blessing had become less of a wish and more of a rhythm, like breath, like heartbeat. He no longer waited for results, simply lived in a way that made blessings inevitable. Behind the house, the once barren patch of soil was now a soft bed of green. Tiny blooms, delicate and unsure, peeked out from beneath their own surprise. Eli watered them like he always had, but now he whispered to each one. Not loud enough for the village to hear, only the petals. "You are seen," he said to one. "You belong to another. You matter to the smallest of them all." And he meant it. The village began changing too, not because of him, but because of what he reminded them. People started planting things, not just in gardens, but in conversations. Someone began saying thank you more often. Someone else started singing on their porch. A child created a sign that read, "Come as you are," and hung it on a tree. And through it all, Eli remained the same, quiet, present, a lighthouse that never moved, but always pointed home. One evening, just before dusk, he climbed the little hill behind the village, the one where the sky felt closer. He sat with his legs crossed and looked up. "I kept speaking," he whispered, "even when you didn't speak back." A cloud passed above him, shaped like nothing at all, and then, suddenly, like a pair of open hands, He didn't cry. He didn't laugh. He just said the blessing again, louder this time. May all that is meant for me arrive with gentleness. May all that is not leave in peace. The words didn't echo. They didn't bounce. They didn't shimmer or shake the air. But somewhere in the vast invisible, something nodded, and he felt it. For the first time, the sky repeated him, not in sound, but in stillness, as if agreeing, as if saying, we've been listening all along. And that night, for the first time, Eli didn't speak the blessing before sleep. He didn't need to. He could feel it already waiting on the pillow, as if the blessing had become its own presence, a presence that now whispered. To him, a circle finally complete. It didn't come like a parade. There were no trumpets, no headlines, no miracles with flashing lights. It came slowly, quietly, like a warm scent drifting into a room from a kitchen you didn't know was open. Prosperity, for Eli, wasn't gold. It wasn't sudden wealth or even comfort in the usual sense. It was the way his hands no longer trembled when he poured water. It was the way people looked him in the eyes when they passed. It was the way a chair by his window was never empty. Anymore, not because someone was sitting in it, but because it held presence. One day, he found a small box on his porch. It contained dried herbs, a piece of obsidian, and a handwritten note that simply said, "You made space for me to believe again." He placed the box on a shelf near the cracked mirror, not to admire it, but to remember that wealth often comes, dressed in quiet gratitude. The children in the village had started calling his house the Whispering House. They said you could hear your heart better when you stood near it. Some believed he was a healer. Others thought he was just lucky. But Eli knew he had only done one thing. He had remained. Through droughts, through silence, through the aching doubt of unanswered days, he had remained kind. And kindness, when practiced in solitude, becomes a kind of magnetism the world eventually can't resist. He was never alone anymore, not really. Letters arrived from places he'd never been. Small offerings from strangers who had only heard rumors of a man who said blessings out loud. A woman sent him a pendant and said, "Wear this when you forget who you are." A young artist sent him a drawing of a tree with roots shaped like words. A musician passed by once, stood on the street below his window, and played a melody that matched the rhythm of his morning prayer. Eli didn't chase any of it. He just received, with open palms, with the same humility he had offered his words to the wind. And the wind, it seemed, was now responding. Not with storms, not with speeches, but with gentle reminders that the invisible matters. Behind the house, the once barren patch had become a garden of tiny oddities. Wild herbs, scattered flowers, plants that didn't match but coexisted like a quiet family. He no longer watered them with urgency. He simply checked in, whispered to the leaves, let them know he still saw them. Inside, his home had become a map of unseen treasures. Not riches, but relics of recognition. A teacup from a stranger. A scarf from someone grieving. A candle that refused to melt completely. Prosperity had arrived, not to rescue him, but to reflect him. And in the silence of the evenings, when the sun poured gold onto the floors of his quiet rooms, he would sit with both hands around his cup and say nothing, because now even his silence had value. And that, he thought, was the wealth no one could steal. The morning he turned 73, Eli woke up to birds he didn't recognize. Their song was softer, less melodic, more like breath than music. He lay still for a moment, listening to the way the world was humming. Something had shifted, not in the sky, not in the garden, but in the space between things. He sat up, slowly, touched the floor with both feet like it was sacred, and walked to the window. The village below was still. Fog rested gently on rooftops, like a memory that didn't need to be explained. And yet, something pulsed beneath it, all like the earth itself was remembering him. He whispered his blessing, not out of habit, but as a way of returning a favor. May all that is meant for me arrive with gentleness. May all that is not leave in peace. He didn't wait for a response, but one came. That day, the postman left nothing. Instead, he knocked. In his hands, a journal, old, familiar, one Eli hadn't seen in decades. Someone found this in a box, he said. It had your name. No address. Just your name. Eli opened it. And there they were. His own words. The first versions of the blessing he now carried in his bones. Scribbled on torn pages. Doodles in the margins. Notes of doubt. Notes of defiance. In between them, all hope. Honest, unfinished hope. He held the book to his chest and said nothing. Because he understood, the blessing had returned to him. It had never left. It had simply traveled far to gather more meaning. The next morning, someone knocked again, then another, and another. People came with no questions, only stories. I set your blessing to my newborn. I wrote it on my mirror. I whispered it before my surgery. I taught it to my mother before she passed. I changed the words, but not the soul. And Eli listened, with eyes that had learned how to hold tears without releasing them too soon. They called it Eli's blessing now, but he never claimed it. He said it wasn't his sit, was just something that had arrived when he needed it, and he'd kept it warm until others were ready. One night, long after the village had fallen, asleep, he stood under the sky, no clouds in sight, and whispered the words again. Not for the world, for himself. May all that is meant for me arrive with gentleness. May all that is not leave in peace. And he felt something lift inside him, like a door opening without a handle. He didn't know where it led. He didn't need to. All he knew was that the blessing had never been about changing the world. It had been about staying open to it, about trusting that what is spoken in love never disappears, only circles, grows, deepens, and one day returns. With interest, did you hear it? That quiet sound beneath the story. It wasn't the wind. It wasn't the words. It was you. The part of you that's still waiting, still hoping, still believing in something even if you don't have proof. You. See? Blessings don't always come with bright ribbons. Sometimes they come as silence, as a breath, as an ache that didn't swallow you whole. They arrive when you've almost stopped looking, when your hands are tired, when your heart is too soft to pretend, and yet you speak them, like Eli did, not to be heard, but to remember that your voice still matters. So tonight, I invite you to say it, to quietly, gently, only if it feels right. May all that is meant for me arrive with gentleness, and may all that is not leave in peace. Let those words float. Let them find the dark corners you've been carrying, and let them rest beside you. Like a friend who doesn't need to fix anything, just stay. The world is listening, even now, even here, even as you close your eyes and fall asleep in the arms of something deeper than sound. She moved slowly through the kitchen, not because she was tired, but because moving slowly made everything feel more sacred. Her name was May, and for years now, her dinners had been quiet. The clock ticked in the background like a soft reminder that time was still passing, even when nothing else was. Every evening, just as the sun leaned against a window, she opened the cabinet with a chipped handle, poured out 2 plates, one white with a faded blue rim, and one she had found at a second-hand store that didn't match but felt like it belonged. She ran a cloth over each one, not because they were dirty, but because she liked the feeling of polishing possibility. The table was small, square, set in the corner of the room where the evening light hit at an angle that made everything look older and warmer. She placed the first plate in front of her chair, where the wood was worn from years of quiet meals. Then she placed the second plate diagonally across from her. If someone had just stepped out and might return any minute. She unfolded 2 napkins. One she smoothed over her lap. The other she folded gently beside the second plate, with a silver fork and spoon placed just so, like a promise. She poured water into 2 glasses, one slightly fuller than the other. And when she lit the candle in the middle of the table, it was never just for her. She sat down slowly, her movements deliberate, and for a brief moment, she looked at the empty chair, not with sadness, not with expectation, but with reverence, as if it were not empty at all but waiting. That was how she began, every night, no matter what. Even when her back ached, even when the meal was simple, even when no one had knocked on her door in days, she prepared for someone unseen. And though the chair had remained empty for years, she treated it as sacred space. She believed deeply, silently, almost stubbornly, that what you make room for eventually arrives. Not always on time, not always as expected, but always when you're ready to receive it. Her neighbors thought she was peculiar. Why the extra plate? They'd ask with sideways smiles. Old habit, she'd say. But it wasn't a habit. It was a ritual. It was how she whispered to the universe, I'm ready. I believe. I deserve to share this table. She remembered when she first began setting the second plate. It was after a long season of loneliness, a kind of cold that didn't come from weather, but from forgetting that you are still worthy of presence. One night, she looked at the table set for one and felt something inside her shrink. So she went to the cabinet, took out a second plate, and placed it down. It felt foolish, but it also felt like an opening, like turning on a porch light, in case someone was walking by in the dark. And the next night, she did it again, and again, and again. At first, she imagined someone sitting there, sometimes a friend, sometimes a stranger, sometimes a version of herself that had more courage. But over time, she stopped imagining faces. The chair became a symbol, not of absence, but of invitation. She began cooking meals that were just a little too much for one person. She'd make extra portions and store them in small containers labeled just in case. Sometimes she'd eat in silence. Sometimes she'd speak softly, as if to fill the space between bites. I'm glad you're here, she'd whisper, not needing a reply, just letting the energy know it was welcome. And the room, in return, began to feel less empty. The candle flickered more gently. The shadows softened. The silence turned warm. She didn't need proof. She only needed presence. And presence, she learned, is something you create first before it arrives. She didn't skip a single night. Even when her hands trembled, even when the weather curled around the house like a tired animal, even when the day had given her nothing, she still set that second plate. Always with care, always with quiet ceremony. The plate never changed position. It always sat in the same place, across from her, as if consistency itself could become a magnet for miracles. She would press the napkin with her fingers to flatten out invisible wrinkles. She'd run the tip of her nail around the edge of the glass, watching the water ripple faintly. She did not imagine who would sit there anymore. It was no longer about a person. It was about permission. The room had begun to shift, almost imperceptibly. The way the light came in through the window in the evening softer now. The way the wooden table held warmth longer after sunset. The way the candle burned steadier, as if it, too, had stopped waiting and had simply begun believing. On the 12th day of spring, a spoon clinked differently when she set it down. Louder, not broken, just different. She paused, hand hovering over the plate, listening as if sound itself had something to say. Then she nodded just once and continued. Some evenings, she'd place a small flower on the extra plate. Not every time. Just when the feeling asked for it. A daisy once, a lavender stem. One evening, a single basil leaf curled like it had, overheard something tender, and when she sat down, she always paused for a breath before touching her own fork, as if waiting for the room to settle, as if giving the unseen guest a chance to speak first. Nothing ever happened, and yet everything was happening. Her meals became slower, more thoughtful. She seasoned with her hands, not her eyes. She cooked, with music playing low, songs without lyrics, melodies that filled the corners of the kitchen like steam. She wore a different sweater some nights, just for herself. She lit 2 candles instead of 1. She began folding her napkin with a little twist at the end, a spiral like a quiet signature. Her neighbors started noticing changes they couldn't explain. You look more rested, one said. Something feels lighter in you, said another. She didn't answer with explanations. She didn't talk about the plate. She just smiled and nodded, like someone who had learned the difference between silence and emptiness. One evening, after a long walk home, she arrived at the front door and felt a stillness that surprised her. Not the kind of stillness that waits, the kind that welcomes. She stepped inside and said aloud, "Thank you for holding space, even though the house had no ears. Or maybe it did, because the air felt warmer." That night, she made soup. Not because it was cold, but because soup felt like something you could share, even with the invisible. She added extra herbs. She stirred it clockwise. She hummed. She set the 2 plates. She lit the candles. She poured water. And just before sitting down, she caught a reflection of herself in the window. For a moment, she thought she saw 2 people at the table, but it passed. Still, something inside her smiled. The chair was still empty, but the plate no longer waited. It belonged. It had a place in the ritual. It was part of the story now. And sometimes that's all a blessing needs. A place to land, even if the landing hasn't happened yet. The room had learned to wait with her. Not just the chair, not just the plate, but every object inside that four-walled quiet began to carry a different kind of presence. The curtains didn't move the same way anymore. They swayed slower, like they had joined her rhythm. The floorboards creaked less, as if they respected the ritual. Even the shadows chose softer corners, curling gently under tables instead of reaching for her feet. She began noticing details she hadn't before, the way the light painted golden lines across the counter at exactly 6:14 in the evening. The subtle difference in sound between the tea kettle just before and just after the boil. The soft click of her own breath when she paused long enough to hear it. These things had always been there, but now they felt like conversation. As if the room, in its quiet loyalty, had decided to keep her company in the same language she offered it, attention without demand. She began lighting incense not for the smell, but for the movement of the smoke. She liked how it curled toward the ceiling like thoughts that didn't need words. Some nights she would set the table and sit in silence for long minutes before even touching her spoon. She would breathe with her eyes open, hands resting gently on her lap, just listening, not for sounds, but for permission. She began to believe that space itself had memory, that the chair remembered every meal it had never been used for, and somehow held each one like pages in a book waiting to be read. She never said the same thing aloud twice. Sometimes it was, "You're welcome to stay." Sometimes, "I saved the best piece for you." Sometimes, "I'm not in a rush tonight." And once, in a whisper she didn't even mean to speak, "You don't have to knock. You already belong." The next morning, she found a feather on the extra plate, pale gray, perfectly still. No windows had been open. No breeze had entered. She held it between her fingers, like a message not meant to be explained. She didn't smile. She didn't question. She simply picked up the feather, placed it in the drawer beside the matches, and set the plate again that evening, this time with the softest linen napkin she owned. The presence in the room deepened. Even the clock ticked slower, or at least it felt that way. Meals became gentler. She stopped overcooking things. She stirred more slowly. She plated the food with care, even when it was just toast or broth, or a slice of baked apple, and always 2 portions, 2 glasses of water, 2 candles. Sometimes she added a 3rd fork to the table, not because she expected someone else, but because abundance had started to whisper louder than loneliness. She didn't need answers. She didn't crave signs. She was simply becoming fluent in the language of space. And the room, faithful, warm, transformed, held it all like a womb for what had not yet arrived, but most certainly would. She no longer rushed through dinner, not because the food had changed, but because the moment had. Each meal became a meditation, each bite a choice. She would raise her spoon gently, pause halfway between bowl and mouth, and breathe just once, slowly before continuing. It was not about etiquette, it was about presence. The way the soup warmed her lips, the way the bread crackled slightly as it tore, the weight of the fork in her hand. These details anchored her to something deeper than hunger. Across the table, the extra plate remained still, untouched, yet never unnoticed. She often found herself glancing toward it mid-meal, not with longing, but with acknowledgement, as if it were a guest who listened more than spoke. She would chew thoughtfully, eyes soft, and sometimes a thought would arrive that felt like it belonged to both of them. One evening, as she sipped tea after finishing her meal, she spoke without thinking. "I'm learning to receive without evidence." The words felt like a confession, but also a vow. They hung in the air like perfume, slowly dissolving into silence. And that silence, it was different now. It wasn't the absence of noise. It was the presence of waiting. A generous pause between heartbeats. The kind of silence that holds space for things not yet said. She began paying attention to the way her hands moved, the way her fingers tucked the cloth napkin beneath the plate, the way she wiped the rim of the glass before setting it down. Each gesture had become a message. I am ready. I am open. I am enough. The kitchen absorbed her rhythm. The drawer slid smoother. The faucet dripped less. The kettle began to sing in softer tones. Even the dishes seemed to clink in harmony instead of resistance. One night, during a gentle rain, she lit 3 candles instead of 2. She didn't plan to. Her hand simply reached for the 3rd. She placed it slightly off-center on the table, closer to the extra plate. The flame flickered as if it knew it had been chosen. She didn't say anything that night. She didn't need to. Her stillness had learned to speak. She took a bite of honeyed rice, felt the grains dissolve slowly on her tongue, and looked out the window. The raindrops rolled down the glass like small prayers returning to earth. For a moment, she imagined someone sitting in the empty chair, not a face, not a form, just a feeling. Warmth, peace, like the presence of something that didn't need a name. She took another bite, slower, quieter, and the silence between each one felt holy, because in those pauses, something grew. Not outside, inside, a quiet certainty that she was no longer dining alone, not because someone had arrived, but because she had. She had shown up, fully, night after night, bite after bite, wordless but awake, and that, she realized, was abundance. Not what you're given, but how you sit with what you've already made room for. It was a Thursday when the air felt heavier than usual. The kind of air that doesn't blow, doesn't move, just presses. The kind that wraps around the lungs like a wet cloth. She had returned home late, her shoes slightly damped from puddles she hadn't expected, her shoulders carrying the weight of a day that gave nothing back. There was no specific reason, just a deep quiet inside her, the kind that doesn't ask for attention but also doesn't let you ignore it. She dropped her keys into the bowl by the door and stared at the kitchen table. It looked the same, familiar, faithful, but something in her ached. A whisper, uninvited but persistent, slid through her chest. Maybe tonight, just eat alone. She stood still, one hand on the back of the chair, the other brushing her coat from her shoulders. The room waited. The plates inside the cupboard waited. The napkins, the silverware, even the candle on the shelf fall of it, paused, as if unsure whether the ritual would continue. She opened the cupboard, reached for one plate, hesitated. Her fingers hovered over the second, and for the first time in months, she considered leaving it there. Just one plate tonight, just one glass. Just a single seat, acknowledged. Would it matter? Would anything change? Her hand trembled slightly as it touched the edge of the second plate. She closed her eyes. The silence didn't answer. Or maybe it didn't, the way silence always does. In the space it offers for truth to echo. She placed both plates on the counter, side by side. She didn't rush. She didn't explain. She just moved, as if her body still remembered what her spirit doubted. One napkin, then the second. One glass of water, then another. The candle was harder to light tonight. The match took longer to catch. She tilted it, waited, breathed. The flame finally flickered, smaller than usual, but alive. She set the table exactly as she always had, but this time she sat down more slowly, as if her heart needed permission. She placed both hands on the table, palms flat, and whispered, "I don't know why I'm still doing this, but I know something inside me would break if I stopped." And with that, the heaviness didn't lift, but it softened. It curved around her instead of crushing her. She lifted her spoon and took a bite, one slow mouthful, then another. The food didn't taste different, but her body received it with more kindness. She looked across the table at the empty chair, at the flickering candle, and allowed herself to weep, not from despair, but from release, because faith isn't always loud. Sometimes it's just not quitting. Sometimes prosperity begins in the night you almost gave up, but didn't, and the chair remained. The plate stayed, and something deep inside her whispered back, "Thank you for not abandoning me." The morning after the night she almost didn't set the second plate, the world felt slightly different. Not louder, not brighter, just clearer. As if someone had wiped a window she hadn't realized was fogged. The sky was pale and open. The light came in with a softness that felt deliberate. She moved through the kitchen the same way she always had, only this time her footsteps felt more rooted, her breath deeper. There was no sign, no voice, no miracle, just stillness. And yet, the stillness no longer felt empty. That evening, she set the table again. 2 plates, 2 glasses, 2 napkins folded slowly with fingertips pressed like prayer. The candle lit with the first match. The food was simple stew and warm bread, the kind that fills the room with home. She sat down, looked across the table, and smiled, not because anyone was there, but because something was. Not a person, not a ghost, not an answer, just a knowing that she was not alone, that the space she had been holding all this time had not been wasted, that somewhere, in some way, the universe had been watching her, opened that seat night after night, and had decided, yes, now is the time. She didn't hear footsteps, no knock, no door creaking. Just a warmth, slow and steady, settling into the chair across from her like steam rising from a full cup. She looked down. The second spoon had shifted slightly, only an inch, but it had moved. She didn't reach for it. She didn't need to. She simply closed her eyes and whispered, "Thank you for arriving quietly." That night, she didn't put the plates away. She left them as they were, side by side. Candle still flickering, chair still warm. She walked to the window and stared out into the quiet night where the stars blinked gently like small affirmations. And then, as she turned to go to bed, she paused. A feather on the second chair. Pale gold this time. Weightless, still. She picked it up without surprise, without questions. She placed it on the windowsill, not as a trophy, but as a continuation. She slept with the covers pulled gently to her chin, the room breathing with her. And somewhere between one dream and the next, she heard a voice not outside, not in words, but inside the space where longing had once lived. It said simply, "You made space, and space made way." She smiled in her sleep, and the chair, the plate, the candle, the light, everything stayed as it was. A table, no? Longer waiting. A table that had already been answered. Did you feel it? That quiet faith she carried. The way she made space not because something had arrived, but because it could. That's the kind of belief the world listens to. The kind that whispers, "I am worthy of sharing the table." Maybe tonight you've also been setting places. No, one has filled. Maybe you've been preparing without reward, giving without applause, believing, even with tired hands. But here's the secret she knew sometimes. The preparation is the invitation. Sometimes what we welcome long before it culminates. What makes it find us at all? Every plate she placed was a prayer. Every candle she lit was a signal. I haven't given up, and neither have you. So as you lie here now, letting your body soften into the mattress, letting the day dissolve behind your breath, I want you to know you are not waiting in vain. You are welcoming, and when the world finally arrives in, its quiet, unexpected wait won't need to knock, because you've already set the table. Sleep now, in peace, in trust, in readiness. Everything you've made space for is already on its way. Elliot's first notebook was brown with soft cardboard covers and a tiny tear on the bottom right corner that he never fixed. He got it when he was 9, handed to him by his father one evening after dinner with no explanation, no instruction. Just a half smile and a nod that said, "This is yours now." He held it like it mattered, but didn't know why. The pages smelled like dust and possibility. He didn't write anything in it. Not at first. Not for weeks. He would carry it everywhere under. His arm to school, beside him at breakfast, resting silently next to his pillow as he slept. His mother asked once, "Why don't you write something?" And he just shrugged, because it didn't feel ready. The pages were too clean, too quiet. He liked that. He liked the idea of having something that was his, but not yet filled. His. Father never asked what he had written. He never asked if it was being used. He just kept giving Elliot pencils, fresh ones, never sharpened as if saying, "I'm not rushing you. I just believe you'll know when it's time." But time, for Elliot, was not something he chased. He watched more than he wrote. Watched how his father would fold bills too neatly into envelopes. Watched how the same old radio sat in the same corner for years, but still played like it had been bought yesterday. Watched how the house was full of things, but never full of peace. There were always conversations about not enough. Not enough hours. Not enough gas. Not enough space. Not enough money? Can so much energy around things they had bought but couldn't keep. A couch with payments. A phone with a plan. A fridge that worked only when you kicked it. Elliot started noticing how tired his father looked when talking about money, and how differently he breathed when talking about anything else. And so, The notebook remained empty, not because he had nothing to say, but because he was still watching. Every evening, he would sit on the porch after dinner and just look across the street. That's where Mr. Alcott lived, the man with the calm shoes and the quiet car. His house looked normal, even smaller than theirs, but it felt different. It didn't carry noise, no deliveries, no shouting, no clutter spilling from windows, just stillness. Mr. Alcott was old. He moved slowly, not because of age, but because he never seemed to need to move fast. He wore the same jacket all season and smiled with his eyes. Elliot didn't know what he did for work. He was always home, always doing something invisible, reading, sweeping, drinking tea, sometimes just staring out the window like he was listening to something the world had forgotten. One afternoon, Elliot's notebook slipped from his hands and fell down the porch steps. He chased after it, and it landed right at the edge of Mr. Alcott's lawn. The man looked up from a book, walked over without words, picked it up, and held it out. He looked at the cover, then at Elliot, and said, "Only this, the best pages are the ones you wait to fill." Then he handed it back and walked away. That night, Elliot opened the notebook, still blank. He turned to the first page, and at the very bottom corner, with the faintest pressure of pencil, he wrote, "Today I learned something without writing it down." Then he closed it, not to finish, but to listen better, because something told him that wealth wasn't what people said. It was what they noticed before anyone else. Elliot began noticing how full the house was. Not with people, there were only 3 of them, but with objects that seemed to multiply when no one was watching. The hallway closet couldn't close without the door pressing into coats they never wore. The drawer in the kitchen, the one they called the junk drawer, was too full to open smoothly. The bathroom shelves were crowded with expired creams, empty bottles, toothbrushes in colors no one remembered choosing. The living room had 3 remote controls, but only 1 television. The television itself was larger than the room allowed. You had to tilt your head slightly to see the screen without glare. His father called it an investment. His mother called it a good deal. Elliot never said anything, but he started watching the reflection of the room in the dark screen when it was turned off. He noticed how it showed more than it hid. The walls were covered in frames photos, quotes, a plastic clock that ticked too loudly. But when he walked through the house, what he felt wasn't beauty. It was noise, visual noise. Shelves filled with knickknacks and souvenirs from places they didn't visit anymore. A blender that whirred, but smelled like burning. A treadmill used mostly for drying towels. Elliot once counted how many chairs were in the house. 10. 10 chairs for 3 people. One of them was broken. No one sat in it, but it stayed. The kitchen table had scratches and stickers from when he was younger. It was covered most nights with unopened mail. His father would sit down, sigh, move the envelopes into a pile, and eat beside them. Elliot noticed he never threw them away. She shuffled the weight. One day, Elliot asked his mother, "Why do we have so many things if we always say we have no money?" She smiled tightly and said, "We need them." But he could tell by her voice that need didn't mean the same thing as use. That night, Elliot opened his notebook and wrote a question instead of a sentence. Can something be valuable if it only makes you feel poorer? He closed the book, didn't answer himself. He didn't have to. The house answered every day, Cupboards were full of food they didn't like. The freezer held frozen meals that no one touched. The cereal box sat with its bag crumpled inside, half air. The fridge hummed louder than any conversation. His father worked late hours, always tired, always needing a break. But on weekends, he liked to buy things: a new speaker, a lawn trimmer, a tool set. Boxes arrived. His mother would shake her head, but she wouldn't send them back. Elliot wondered how something called delivery could still feel like more debt arriving. He noticed how the happiness from new things lasted exactly 2 days.
Did that?
They just joined the background. More weight, space taken, less breath. He looked across the street again. Mr. Alcott's porch had a single chair, a ceramic pot with no plant, a broom hanging from a nail, space that didn't try to be filled. One Saturday, Elliot sat in his room, surrounded by his own things. Toys from years ago, books he hadn't read, gifts he didn't remember asking for. He looked around and realized none of it made him feel full, just busy. So he took one toy and placed it in a box, then a second, then a third. Not to throw away, just to see what space looked like. When his mother asked what he was doing, he said softly, "Just making room." That night, he didn't turn on the TV. He sat on the floor, notebook open, pencil resting between his fingers. And for the first time, he wrote a full sentence without stopping. We say we have nothing, but we're surrounded by everything that takes instead of gives. Then he placed the notebook beside him, turned off the lamp, and stared into the dark. The silence felt richer than anything he owned. Every morning before school, Elliot would sit by the window with a bowl of cereal and a pencil he never used. The cereal always got soggy too quickly, and the pencil just rolled back and forth across the table. But what he really focused on was, across the street in Mr. Alcott, he was always up early, not rushed, not in a hurry like the others on their way to work, just up, present. Elliot noticed how Mr. Alcott swept his porch in slow, straight lines. He never looked at his phone. Elliot wasn't even sure he had one. Sometimes Mr. Alcott would stop mid-motion, lean against the wooden rail, and look out at nothing, just the sky, or a tree, or the way light hit the neighbor's bricks. He moved like time was his, not borrowed. Elliot didn't understand what that meant, but he felt it in his chest every time he watched. His father moved fast, always trying to catch up, always out of breath, always saying things like, "Someday we'll get ahead." But Mr. Alcott never spoke like that. When they crossed paths rarely, he'd just nod and smile. One day, Elliot gathered the courage to ask, "What do you do?" Mr. Alcott paused, as if the question was heavier than it sounded. "I let money work," he said, then added softly, "so I don't have to." Elliot didn't know what that meant. Not then, but he wrote it in his notebook, slowly, word by word. He began watching more closely. Mr. Alcott never had packages at his door, never drove a new car, but somehow, he always looked, rested. Elliot started noticing patterns. Every week, on Thursdays, Mr. Alcott would walk downtown for about 40 minutes, always carrying a slim leather folder. He'd come back with nothing. No bags, no receipts, just the same folder and the same calm face. One day, Elliot followed from a distance. Mr. Alcott walked to a small building with a brass sign that read, "Trusts and Real Assets." He stayed inside for only 15 minutes. Elliot sat across the street with his notebook in his lap and watched. People come and go. All of them walked quickly, most on phones. None of them smiled, but Mr. Alcott did. On the way home, he stopped for a loaf of bread and nodded at the woman sweeping the bakery floor like they'd known each other for decades. Elliot wrote in his notebook that night, "He never buys anything, but he always looks full." Back at his own house, the rhythm was different. Fast footsteps, raised voices, TV noise, stress, boxes, deadlines. Elliot began to feel like the walls inside his home were trying to close in, while the world across the street was opening slowly, like a book that didn't mind being read aloud. On Saturdays, Elliot sat on the front step with his own notebook, pretending to draw. Mr. Alcott would wave. Once, he brought over 2 cups of warm lemon water and handed one to Elliot without speaking. They sat together for 5 whole minutes without a word, just sipping, just listening. Elliot thought silence had never sounded so generous. Before leaving, Mr. Alcott looked at him and said, "Most people chase the wind and wonder why they feel empty. Let it pass, then plant." Elliot wrote that down too, then underlined it twice. From that day on, he stopped asking what people did. He started asking how they moved. And Mr. Alcott moved like he already had what he needed. Not because he had more, but because he had decided what enough felt like. Elliot wasn't sure how to describe it, but he knew it felt different. Like the sound of a door opening you didn't know was locked. The first time Elliot realized numbers had a voice. It wasn't in school. It wasn't from a teacher or a textbook or even a calculator. It was in Mr. Alcott's garage. Not the kind of garage filled with old bikes and broken tools, but one that smelled like cedar and patience. Mr. Alcott had invited him over one morning. Not with fanfare, just a simple wave from across the street and a gesture that said, "If you're curious, come." Elliot followed quietly, notebook in hand. Inside the garage, there were no cars, just shelves. And on those shelves were boxes labeled not by season or category, but by year. 1998, 2001, 2010, 2023. Mr. Alcott opened one marked 2005 and pulled out a single sheet of paper. It was yellowed, but crisp. A column of numbers written by hand. Rent received, expenses paid, net remaining. "This," he said softly, tapping the page, "is a building I've never touched. But it pays me every month." Elliot stared at the paper, then at Mr. Alcott. "How?" he asked. Mr. Alcott sat on a stool, motioned for Elliot to do the same. "Most people work for money," he said, "but money can work without you, if you give it a job." Elliot blinked. "Like hiring it?" Mr. Alcott smiled. "Exactly. Every dollar can be a worker or a vacationer. Most people spend their dollars on things that rest. I send mine to build." He pulled another sheet. "This one is a vending machine in a building downtown. I haven't seen it in years, but it sends me letters like this every month." Elliot looked closer. There were coins drawn in the margins. He wasn't sure if it was a joke or a system. Mr. Alcott leaned in. "Money is like water. It flows where there's a channel. If you don't build a path, it seeps into the ground." Elliot wrote that down. word for word. He watched as Mr. Alcott opened a small drawer and took out a check, dated 3 days. Go. $312.48. From the laundromat I own with 2 friends, he said. They run it. I helped start it. I don't go there, but every month it speaks to me. Elliot stared at the check. It wasn't much, but it was something, and it arrived without noise, without sweat, without a clock ticking behind it. Do you ever worry about running out of money? Elliot asked. Mr. Alcott folded the check carefully and placed it in an envelope. No, he said, 'cause I only buy things that speak back. Elliot tilted his head. Speak back. Yes, most people buy silence. Shoes that never respond. TVs that only take your time, but an asset. An asset whispers to you every month, here, I haven't forgotten you. Elliot wrote that down too. And as he did, something shifted inside him. Numbers weren't just cold facts. They were language. They told stories. They could be kind or cruel, depending on how you met them. That night, Elliot went home and opened the junk drawer in the kitchen. He found a receipt from the hardware store, a drill his father bought 6 months ago. Used once. Price, $139.99. He flipped the paper over and wrote, "This tool said nothing back." Then he opened his notebook and drew a new column. One side labeled Things That Talk, the other Things That Don't. He stared at the list for a long time. The next morning, he brought the notebook to Mr. Alcott and showed him the list. Mr. Alcott didn't speak. He just nodded and handed Elliot an empty envelope. On the front, he had written, First Asset. Elliot held it like a seed, and he didn't rush to fill it, because now he was listening. Elliot started listening with more than his ears. He began hearing things in the way people moved, in how they opened wallets, in the pause between swiping a card and pretending not to feel it. At school, lunch lines were filled with noise buzzing about who bought what, who got new shoes, whose birthday meant fast food instead of packed sandwiches. Elliot never joined those conversations. He watched, noticed how people who had the most to show were also the ones most afraid of losing it. He once saw a boy cry quietly in the hallway after dropping his new phone. He didn't cry because it broke. He cried because it would no longer prove something. Elliot walked home in silence that day, counting the sounds that money made in his neighborhood. Cars that revved too loudly, TVs shouting through windows, delivery boxes dropped with a thud, laughter that ended too quickly. But Mr. Alcott's house, always quiet, always calm, no surprise boxers, no sudden music, just rhythm. Elliot noticed that his own home had a soundtrack. The microwave beeped often. The doorbell rang more than it should. Packages arrived on Thursdays. His father complained on Fridays. The sound of spending was familiar, like background noise. No one questioned, but savings. Saving made no sound. Elliot had started his envelope, the one labeled First Asset. He hadn't placed much inside, just coins, a few crumpled bills from birthday cards he never spent, a paperclip that looked like a question mark. But every time he slipped something inside, he listened, and the silence afterward felt different, like he had planted something. Not a lot, but something real. His mother once asked why he never used his allowance. He smiled and said, because It's still working. She didn't ask what he meant, but she looked at him for a moment longer than usual, like something about him had changed. At school, he kept quiet when others bragged about new jackets. He wore the same coat from last year. It still fit, still warmed him. He didn't need to say anything. Mr. Alcott once told him, "Every dollar you don't spend is a seed you still control." Okay. Elliot wrote that on the inside flap of his notebook. One afternoon, Elliot was invited to the mall with friends. They had plans to buy, to spend, to eat. He said yes, but brought nothing but a pencil. He walked through the stores, observed the lights, the music, the signs yelling about discounts that weren't really discounts. His friends bought things quickly, smiled big, then smaller. By the end of the afternoon, their bags were full, but their eyes were dim. One of them said, "I thought this would feel better." Elliot didn't respond. He just looked around. The noise was everywhere: marketing, transactions, receipts. But under it all, he could hear something else, the sound of emptiness pretending to be abundance. That night, he didn't write anything. He just opened the envelope again, placed his fingers lightly on the paper inside, and breathed. The envelope didn't shout. It didn't sparkle. It didn't rush. But it felt like something that was building its own echo. And that, Elliot thought, was the kind of sound worth waiting for. Happened on a Wednesday that looked like every other. The kind of day where the clouds were undecided and the wind carried the scent of somewhere else. Elliot had walked the same route from school 100 times, but that day he paused at a corner shop he usually passed. The sign in the window wasn't flashy. It didn't shout a sale. It simply read, "Used books, $1 or trade." Inside, the air was thick with paper and possibilities. The man behind the counter was old, but not tired. He greeted Elliot with a nod, as if he'd been expecting him, even if he hadn't. Elliot walked through the narrow aisles, brushing his fingers along spines of forgotten stories. He stopped at a shelf marked business, self. The words felt heavy together. He pulled out a thin book titled "Things That Work While You Sleep." The pages were yellowed, but underlined by someone who once cared. On the back, a quote, "An asset is a servant that never eats." Elliot smiled. He had $2.37 in his envelope. Enough. He brought it to the counter, offered the crumpled dollar and the coins. The old man took the money, placed the book in a paper bag, and added something else, a small, folded flyer. "Try this," he said. "You might see the world differently." Elliot thanked him and walked home slowly, the bag tucked under his arm like it was made of glass. That night, under a soft lamp, Elliot read the book cover to cover. It wasn't complicated. It spoke of vending machines, digital products, rental bikes, parking space, small things that paid without asking for attention. Elliot didn't sleep. Right away, he reread one line over and over. If your money isn't moving without you, then it owns you. The next morning, he showed the flyer to Mr. Alcott. It was an ad for a local community market offering tiny stalls for rent on weekends. $5 a day? Sell anything legal. Mr. Alcott read it, then asked simply, "What would you sell?" Elliot didn't hesitate. Bookmarks, handmade. Mr. Alcott's eyes twinkled. And why? Because people who read, Elliot said, are building something inside, and maybe They'll remember the hand that marked the page. That Saturday, Elliot set up a small table. He'd spent the night before cutting cardboard, decorating them with quotes, some silly, some wise. He called his little stall Quiet Marks. He sold 3. Not much, $3 total, but more than he had started with, and more than that one customer came back, not to buy, but to ask, "Are you the boy who made this one?" She held up a bookmark that read, "Let money work while you rest." Elliot nodded. She smiled. "My husband needs to hear that. Can I take another?" Elliot gave it to her for free. That night, he wrote in his notebook, "Today, I sold something made from silence, and it spoke to someone else." The next week, he made $5, then 10. He reinvested in colored paper. A neighbor offered to print a few designs for free. Slowly, he saved enough for the next envelope, second asset, but he didn't rush. He kept returning to the little bookshop, sometimes just to sit. The old man never asked questions, only offered quiet. Elliot learned that real growth isn't loud. It whispers. It returns slowly. But when it does, it brings something deeper than just money. It brings trust in yourself, in your patience, and in the invisible seeds that bloom when no one is watching. Years passed, but Elliot never stopped listening. The bookmarks turned into journals, the journals into quiet tools for others who, like him, were tired of noise disguised as success. He never owned a big house, never drove a loud car, but every room he entered seemed to slow down like it was, waiting for him to speak. And most of the time, he didn't. He built things, not empires. He invested in moments, not appearances. People sometimes asked him where he studied finance. He'd smile and say, "I watched a man who listened too." Numbers? Others wondered why he didn't expand faster, why his money moved slower than it could. He'd shrugged and reply, "Because my wealth isn't in motion, it's in peace." His friends chased louder things. They built towers of tasks, goals, upgrades. Elliot built mornings, long walks, meals that weren't rushed, conversations that didn't end with a notification. He still had envelopes, dozens, each labeled by intent, not urgency, for seeds, for silence, for second chances. Some remained empty for years. Others filled and flowed without announcement. One day, a boy knocked on his door, not selling, not asking, just curious. Elliot recognized the look in his eyes. It was the same look he had once carried across the street to Mr. Alcott. He invited the boy in, offered him a cup of water and a stool. "What do you want to know?" Elliot asked gently. The boy hesitated. "How do you get rich?" Elliot looked at the boy's hands, clean, eager, nervous. He didn't rush to answer. He let the silence settle and said, "You stop trying to look rich, and you start building a life that doesn't need proving." The boy nodded, wrote something in a small notebook. Elliot noticed the label. First, a set. He smiled. The same smile Mr. Alcott once gave him. Time had folded in on itself. The silence had echoed forward. That night, Elliot sat by his window with no music, no TV, no phone. Just a breeze, a blanket, and a small thought. He had never chased wealth. He had cultivated it, and in the slow, deliberate pace of his days, something miraculous had happened. He had become free, not because of how much he had, but because of how little he needed to feel full. Now that your eyes are growing heavy, take a deep breath. You've just heard the story of a boy who didn't chase money, but learned to listen to what it was really saying. Maybe, for a long time, you've tried to prove something to the world, to your family, to someone who doesn't even see you anymore. But this story was a soft reminder. True prosperity doesn't shout, doesn't show off, doesn't arrive in a flash. It grows quietly in the rhythm of those who respect time. You don't need all the answers tonight. You don't need the perfect plan. Like Elliot, you can simply observe, choose with care, keep what makes sense, and let time do its quiet work while you sleep. The seeds you planted with this listening are growing roots, and maybe, slowly, you'll wake up lighter, more abundant, not because you earned more, but because you learned to need less and to value more. Silence is sometimes the sound of harvest unfolding. Good night, beautiful soul. Tomorrow will wait for you, but for now, just rest. True wealth also loves silence. The tailor who sewed dreams in a city where the days seemed all the same and people walked staring at the ground. There was a small tailor shop hidden between an old bookstore and a quiet bakery. Inside, there was no sound of machines, nor the hurried rhythm of scissors. The only sound was the calm breathing of an old man sitting by the window, a fine needle in his hands and colorful fabrics folded like secrets on his table. His name was Abilio, but no one called him that. In truth, hardly anyone called him at all. He was simply known as the slow tailor, as if that were a flaw. But what no one knew was that Abilio didn't sew clothes. He sewed dreams. He stitched patiently the desires that others had forgotten. With every stitch, he added intention. With every fold, he placed silence. His fabrics didn't come from stores. They came from memories. A piece of sky blue fabric from someone's first glimpse of the ocean. A dark wine hue from an old embrace that never returned. A soft gold shade from a morning where everything had gone right. He collected these memory fragments floating through the air, and while everyone else slept, he sat with steady hands and peaceful eyes to transform them into small garments. But they were not for the body. They were for the soul. Coats of courage, scarves of patience, cloaks of new beginnings. One night, a girl appeared at his door. She didn't speak much. She only looked with tired eyes that had grown up too fast. Abilio asked nothing. He simply smiled, pulled out a violet fabric that smelled of lavender, and began to sew. Hours later, he handed her a small vest. "It's made of hope that hasn't been born yet," he said. The girl put it on, smiled with her eyes, and left as if she had remembered who she was. After her, others came. People who didn't know what they were looking for, but left with something they didn't know they needed. And Abilio remained there, invisible to the hurried eyes of the world, but essential as a pause. Some said his clothes brought luck, that those who wore them found their path. But he never said that. He knew the secret wasn't in the clothing, but in the time it took to be born. One day, a young businessman came into the shop. He was exhausted, lost, though his watch was expensive. He asked for a suit. He wanted something that showed power. Abilio sewed in silence. He handed over a light blazer made of old linen and words never spoken. The young man looked at it, confused, and said, "But this doesn't look powerful." Abilio smiled. "Wear it, and then tell me." Months later, the man returned, not to ask for another outfit, but to thank him. He had changed his company, his home, his habits. He said that since that day, everything seemed to make sense. Abilio listened and simply said, "You wore what was already inside you. You just needed to remember." And so the workshop remained. No sign, no lines, no noise, just a warm light in the window and the soft sound of a needle passing through the fabric of the soul. Because, deep down, he knew true prosperity isn't dressed in luxury. It wears presence, intention, and dreams carefully stitched in silence. The garden of the hidden mind there was a quiet village where people used to say that each person carried an invisible garden within a place where the seeds of their thoughts would grow. Among the villagers lived Clara, a simple woman with curious eyes and an open heart. Every night before sleep, Clara had a ritual. She took a deep breath, closed her eyes, and brought to mind an image of abundance. She pictured a golden wheat field, harvesting stalks that shimmered like sunlight. She softly whispered, "I attract prosperity. My subconscious knows the way." These words echoed gently in her inner silence, without hurry, like a familiar melody. During the day, even in small tasks, she remembered that image, believing the field was real, even if invisible. With time, something began to shift. An unexpected job offer arrived. A small investment she had made to learn something new started to bear fruit. But Clara didn't get carried away by excitement. She kept nurturing her mental garden each night, repeating her words softly, keeping her intention clear. One day, sitting on the porch, she noticed how the outside world mirrored her inner state. The people around her became more open. Opportunities began to appear naturally, and doors that were once closed started to open. Everything felt like tiny miracles awakened by the silent power of her mind. Then, she recalled the wisdom from an old book she had read long ago. The subconscious responds to what is planted repeatedly and with emotion, even while you sleep. And she understood, without even realizing it. Her garden had grown overnight, invisible to the eyes, but real in its essence. The prosperity she was looking for didn't arrive suddenly, nor did it fall from the sky in the form of money. It came through small, silent changes, an idea that became a habit that became energy, and that energy multiplied when the sun rose again. That night, as she lay down, Clara opened her arms as if embracing her inner world and whispered, "Thank you, my subconscious, for guiding me." And as she drifted into sleep, her garden bloomed once more, because in the silence of a resting mind, the impossible finds a way. The power to create, to heal, and to prosper lives in the seed of our thoughts. All it takes is watering it with faith. Day after day, the house that built itself, no one really knew how it began, but they said there was a man who lived in a house that never truly existed. His name was Elias, and every day he walked through an empty field with an old notebook in hand. People found it odd. After all, he walked between trees as if invisible walls surrounded him. One day, someone asked, "What do you do out there?" "Every day," Elias replied with a gentle smile in his eyes. "I'm building my house." They laughed. But he didn't. Inside the notebook, he drew rooms, wrote words like warmth, light, shelter. In his mind, he could see open windows, hear the wind fluttering through curtains that didn't yet exist. At night, he'd lie on the ground, close his eyes, and repeat silently, "My house is ready. I live in it." What no one saw was that, while he slept, something within him started to believe, and that belief acted like brick after brick, slowly shaping a structure in the unseen. Days passed. He had no money, no help, no building material, but the idea persisted. Until one day, a woman from the city arrived, looking for someone who knew the land well. Elias guided her. Grateful, she offered him a small payment. With it, he bought his first plank of wood. Later, an old man from the village needed help with a repair. Elias did it with such care that the man recommended him to others. Bit by bit, the house began to take form, not because Elias chased after things, but because something seemed drawn by his quiet certainty. Each plank, each window, every piece seemed to have been prepared long before, in his notebook, in his thoughts, in his heart. He didn't call it luck. He called it a response to what he repeated before sleep every night. The house already exists. It's just waiting to reveal itself. When the house was finally complete, it looked old, like it had always been there. Those who entered said they felt peace. They asked how he built it all by himself. Elias simply said, "I didn't build it. My thoughts brought it here," and he returned to his notebook, now drawing new things, because he knew what you plant in the mind with faith blooms in the world with time, and what seemed impossible, simply invisible for a while. The gardener who planted Checksnow, one knew his name. They just called him the old man at the gate because he was always there, kneeling in front of a small garden that looked far too ordinary to draw so many glances. But there was something unusual. It wasn't flowers growing there, not lettuce nor mint. It was paper, sheets, what looked like checks. Every morning at sunrise, he watered the soil with an old metal can and whispered, "Grow calmly, but grow strong." People would walk by and chuckle, snap a photo, or laugh under their breath. Yet no one could explain why, month after month, he dressed better, wore new shoes, and carried a peaceful gaze. Some said he was crazy. Others called him a magician. The truth was much simpler. That man had learned that everything planted with faith grows in value. And he had chosen to plant value. One day, a young boy approached and asked, "Do you plant money?" The old man smiled without sarcasm and replied, "I plant what you don't understand yet." And he kept watering. Those checks were symbolic, cut from cardboard. On each one, he wrote the name of a dream, the amount he wanted to achieve, and the reason. Each check was an intention, a living purpose. This one's to pay for my daughter's house. This to open Marta's bakery. This to donate to the shelter that raised me. With each watering, he repeated, "It's already real. It's already on its way." Then he would go about his day working with real plants, cleaning gardens, selling jars of fruit preserves. But his mind was always in growth mode. The garden didn't bloom with literal money. But what he cultivated inside began producing results outside. clients started showing up out of nowhere. Unexpected referrals, gifts, prizes, honest offers. Everything looked like coincidence. But at WASN, single quotes, he used to say, "The world gives back what you plant inside yourself." One day, a group of young adults came asking how to do the same. He taught them, first, grow the belief, then, the habit, only then, the harvest. Some laughed, a few gave up. But the ones who stayed began to change. They planted their own checks, wrote down dreams, watered them with patience, and, slowly, the fruits came, not as magic, but as answers. Today, the old man no longer sits at that gate, but his garden became a symbol. Many pass by, leaving a piece of paper with a dream written on it. And they walk away, hearts a little lighter, because they understood true wealth begins when you stop planting fear and start planting faith. In the ancient land of 1,000 olive trees and rivers that whispered beneath the stones, there lived a king whose crown was lighter than most because it carried no pride. His name was not spoken with thunder, but with reverence in hushed tones. Beneath the shadow of fig trees and beside the wells where travelers paused to rest, every morning before the dew surrendered to the sun, he stepped barefoot onto the cold marble floor of the inner chamber. No guards followed, no advisors interrupted. Just the king, the silence, and the space where questions met the invisible. He would kneel on a square of woven cloth, stitched by his mother before she passed, and whisper not commands, not pleas, but questions. Questions as soft as the wind in barley fields. Should I move forward today? Is it time to speak, or time to listen? Which path carries peace, even if it seems like retreat? This ritual, slow and unchanged, had begun when he was just a boy watching his father fall to a battle that should have never been fought. Since then, he had vowed, never again would he let steel answer questions meant for the divine. His people didn't know how he ruled so gently. They only saw the results. A kingdom where granaries never emptied, where merchants arrived from distant lands with silk and spices, where no gold was mined, yet the vaults never echoed hollow. Some whispered of luck, others of secret pacts, but the king knew. Every answer he followed began in silence, not strategy. Even when war loomed, when scouts brought news of armies moving like storms on the horizon, the king never reached for his sword first. He returned to the chamber. He asked, and then he listened. Sometimes the answer came as a feeling behind his ribs. Other times, in the rhythm of a servant's footsteps, or the way the wind shifted through the banners. He had learned to wait, and because he waited, victories arrived, not with blood, but with surrender. Enemies would retreat before the first arrow was loosed. Leaders would arrive weeping, offering treaties instead of threats. And after every unseen battle won, the king would return to the same marble floor, bow his head again, and whisper only, "Thank you." There was a boy in the village, no more than 12 summers old, who once asked the palace gardener if the king was ever afraid. The gardener, a man with knuckles shaped like roots and eyes like walnut wood, simply said, "He is, but he waits anyway." The boy didn't understand then, but he would years later, when he too stood barefoot on a stone path, unsure which way the wind would blow. The king's waiting was not stillness. It was movement of another kind and alignment, while others polished swords and plotted tactics. He aligned his breath, his pulse, and his purpose with something not visible but deeply known. Each morning his questions turned to prayers. Then the prayers dissolved into silence, and in that silence came decisions with weight, like rain on a thirsty land. His robes, always simple, carried the scent of frankincense and old scrolls. Walked slower than other kings, not from weakness, but from awareness, as if each step pressed into the earth a promise. In the marketplace, his name was spoken with warmth, not fear. Children would bow their heads instinctively when he passed, not out of rule, but because something in his presence quieted noise within them. Still, not all days were serene. There were months when the sky refused to speak, when no dream, no whisper, no sign arrived. Those were the hardest mornings, and yet he returned to the chamber, day after day. One morning, after a long season of drought, both of rain and of direction, the king simply asked, "Am I still heard?" The wind paused. A drop of dew landed on his knuckle, and far away the bells of the lower village rang 5 seconds too early. That was all. That was enough. He stood, bowed, and resumed his duties. That afternoon, a caravan arrived unannounced at the eastern gate, bringing not only spices but also maps, and with them, news of a region ready for peace. When scribes recorded these events, they missed the dew, they missed the bells. They recorded the treaties and called it strategy. But the king, he knew the real battle had been won before the sun even rose. In the quiet seasons, when no threats loomed, and the fields swayed in obedient harmony with the wind, the king wandered the outer gardens in robes, the color of dusk. He touched the bark of every cedar as if it held memory, and he paused at each fountain to listen, not for water, but for what the sound carried. His soldiers, trained yet rarely tested, had begun to follow his example. In the barracks before, sharpening blades, they closed their eyes and breathed in unison. A priest once remarked that this was no army, but a choir of silence waiting for divine rhythm. The king smiled when he heard that, because he knew that peace was not the absence of readiness, was readiness without tension. Merchants traveling from distant empires spoke of the kingdom as an enigma. There were no walls high enough to intimidate, no navies to boast of, and yet no invader had succeeded in a generation. Instead of building fortresses, the king built wells, deep and wide, accessible to all. At the edge of each village, a stone inscribed with a simple phrase stood beside the well. No name, no crest, only words. What is offered in stillness returns in strength. Children traced the letters with their fingers. Elders read them aloud before drawing water. And somewhere, in every heart, the phrase became a seed. The treasury, once guarded by 20 men, now remained under the care of 3 scribes and a key made of cedar wood. Gold entered not through conquest, but through trust. Trade routes aligned themselves to the kingdom not because of demand, but because of invitation. Leaders of other lands came to observe, to question, to wonder. Some left unchanged. Others began planting wells in their own soil, hoping to understand the invisible tide that seemed to favor the silent king. And always, no matter the day. The king continued his morning ritual, barefoot, in silence, listening in the still hours before dawn, when even the owls had ceased their questions and the stars were softer than memory. The king sat alone on a carved stone bench beside the temple pool. The water never rippled unless spoken to, and this morning it remained mirror-like. He watched his reflection and saw not his crown, but the small boy who once asked his mother if the stars ever listened. The answer had come slowly over the years, not in words, but in echoes, in winds that changed direction without warning, in strangers who arrived with familiar dreams. This was how the divine spoke now, not in thunder, but in repetition. And so he repeated 2 phrases he didn't invent, movements passed from elders' long-gone rituals that felt absurd to the impatient. That morning, as he bowed once more and whispered a blessing no scribe ever recorded, the pool stirred. One leaf fell from a fig tree, landing not on the water's surface, but just beside his foot. It should have meant nothing, and yet it filled his chest with warmth. By mid-morning, news arrived that a drought to the west had ended unexpectedly. Rains returning with such force they carried seeds to places long abandoned. And so it was that abundance continued, not because of luck or skill, but because every action was a conversation, every silence a request, every gesture a covenant. His people had begun to mirror him not in dress or speech, but in rhythm, in the baker who kneaded bread while humming blessings, in the blacksmith who paused between strikes to remember his grandfather, in the child who left stones in a circle and called it his stream house. The day that followed the 43rd festival of first rain began like all others, with the king lighting the oil lamp himself, his fingers steady, his robe plain, his thoughts silent. But by evening, something rare unfolded. A stranger arrived at the palace gate, not on horseback, nor with caravan, but walking barefoot with a bundle wrapped in linen. He asked for no audience, gave no name, only requested to sit in the garden where the king often walked. When word reached the throne, the king did not question it was enough. He joined the man in silence, and together they watched a turtle cross the stone path. The bundle, it turned out, was filled with soil. Soil from a distant land the king had once dreamed of, but never visited. The man poured it gently beneath the fig tree by the reflecting pool, and whispered, "For what you believed without seeing." Then he left. No one saw him go. The soil took root overnight, though no seed was planted. By morning, sprouts emerged, unfamiliar in shape, but golden at the tips. The scribes recorded it. The priests wept quietly, but the king simply smiled, as if remembering something long promised. That week, tributes from neighboring kingdoms doubled without explanation. Ships that had drifted aimlessly in storm found their way to his harbor, and villagers who had nothing left but song began to trade those very songs for food, shelter, and tools. Prosperity had not arrived with trumpet or decree. It had grown from repetition, from the unseen soil of faith, from the king's refusal to act without first listening. He never claimed credit. He continued rising early, walking slow, pausing before each step, for he understood now the divine does not rush, and what is whispered with devotion echoes longer than what is shouted in ambition. Years later, when the king had become more memory than man, the fig tree by the pool bore fruit no one dared to pick. Its golden blossoms remained untouched, not out of fear, but reverence. Children played in its shade, elders prayed beside it, and travelers left behind coins, stones, or notes with no words. The palace, once a place of decree and dominion, became a sanctuary of rhythm. People arrived not to plead, but to sit, not to rule, but to remember. His throne remained unused, beside the window that opened toward the east, where light came first, and on some mornings, it was said, a shadow would settle there, shaped like a man leaning forward, listening. No one knew what the king had truly heard in all his silences, but they remembered the way he paused before each choice, the way he bowed to nothing visible, the way he believed anyway. That became the new way. And now, dear dreamer, if your feet feel tired from battles no one else sees, if your hands feel empty despite all they've built, maybe tonight is not for answers, but for sitting, for bowing inward, for planting what cannot yet be touched, because maybe the divine waits exactly there, in what you whisper, when no one else hears, in what you repeat, even when you doubt, in what you bless, even when it has not yet bloomed. Sleep now, and let the soil do its quiet work.